So this is our Simondon reading group picking up again after a couple weeks off. So we've been, I think, sorry, let me just check what page I put down. I think I said, I should have checked this. Yeah, so I said last time that we ended at page 63 of the translation. I hope that's correct. So we've been reading part one of the book. So in the introduction, he outlined this sort of cycle of the image. So the image goes from the sort of anterior form, so the image before the encounter with the object, and then there's the image in the encounter with the object, so the present form of the image, and then there's the image after the encounter with the object. So he calls this the symbolic form of the image. And then after this sort of three-part cycle, there's a sort of step up to another level. So there's you can call it a fourth phase or a inter-cycle or whatever that he calls invention. And this cycle, these three phases, happen at three different levels. And so we have ultimately 9 different categories, I guess we can call them. But so the 3 levels are the level of the biological. So at this level, the relationship to the image is one of the whole organism. So we can think of responses like flight or attack, or an organism that perceives an object as a potential mate or as a food source or as a predator or something like that. The whole organism responds to this image that it experiences. And then the second level is, he calls it psychological, but he says this is not an entirely satisfactory terminology. But the idea here is that at this level, it's no longer the whole organism that responds, but it's a sort of partial response of the organism, or the organism sort of separates itself into the image and the responding part as a sort of partial, a subset of that organism that can respond. So you can think of perception in the sort of strict sense of the term. So when you look at an object and you say, okay, this is a chair, this is a table, this is a dog, whatever it is, you are sort of classifying that object under a concept that you have or a category that you have, but you're not sort of immediately attacking it or running away or anything like that. You just sort of organize your perception under a category, and then you might have different actions that might be appropriate for objects of that category. So this is the psychological level. And then the third level is what he calls the reflexive level. So this, he's primarily thinking here of philosophical thought, but we can also think of religious thought, artistic or poetic thought. So anything where our action or our activity is itself the object of thought. So you're not just sort of responding to an object immediately or having this sort of partial response like in the psychological level, but you're now looking at your own response itself and trying to understand that response. So we looked at the images that have to do with this sort of intuition of movement that he described in right at the end of the first part that we read. So he talks about in Plato's theory of the good, the sort of the way that we grasp this idea of the good, or this principle of the good that is above the ideas, is we sort of situate ourselves or imagine ourselves into the position of the good, and then we imagine a kind of expansive movement. We sort of expand outside of ourselves and overflow ourselves into the ideas. We sort of breathe life into the ideas through this expansive movement. And he gives other examples of these sort of intuitions of movement as sort of schemas of thought. And he sort of suggests that this is how we kind of grasp these abstract philosophical doctrines, is through these image schemas. So that's sort of a quick summary of what we saw. So part one was about the image prior to the experience of the object. So the first phase at each of those 3 levels. And then we got to the end of part 1, and we're going to pick up part 2. So the cognitive content of images. So this is going to be this is going to have to do with the second second phase of the at each of the 3 levels. So we'll go through that over the next few weeks. So I'll stop there with the summary. If someone else would like to pick up from the beginning of that section, and I guess go to the subsection break where subsection 2.
I can read. Okay. Part 2, the cognitive content of images and perception. Section A, biological givens of perceptual functions. Subsection 1, primary biological categories and secondary psychical categories. The role of the milieu organized as territory. We may consider the relation to the milieu that takes place according to primary categories of valence and signification to be biological. The first gathering of data that a living being must conduct is that which provides answers to questions such as, quote, is it a predator, a prey, a sexual partner, an offspring of the same species, unquote. To each of these categories of a situation, there corresponds a definite mobilization of the action system of the organism, which bestows a global adaptation to the given situation. Here the object is not yet identified as individual, recognized as this object, already captured in experience. The informational category of the biological is that of a first adaptation in a milieu that is not yet organized. That is not yet organized, recognized, and classified, unless where anything can appear anywhere. It is the state of alertness and vigilance that a living being is forced to maintain outside of its territory. Within the territory, in a world where there is no longer any novelty with regard to vital categories of attack, defense, etc., a living being can deploy a properly psychical activity, one posterior to the identification of the object following the first sifting or classification according to vital categories. The issue is not to oppose the animal to the human, but to situate the frequency of behaviors of a biological or psychical type. The more the milieu is organized, the less it is necessary to conduct a preliminary sifting of signals according to the primary categories. After a cursory categorical scouting, the field is freed up for psychical activity because the class of the object is no longer in doubt. When the nervous system is less developed and possibilities of multisensorial concentration of information weaker, the activity of primary organization takes more room. We must ultimately suppose that animals can only have a properly psychical activity within their territory, and that this territory's size and organization is proportional to the animal's capacities of perception and integration. The consequence specifically is that resolving problems involving the inventive imagination humans deploy, detours, instruments, succeeds much better when an animal is in its territory than when it is in a situation where it could not organize its milieu. It has been noted that jaguars capable of taking long detours when hunting display great inertia in captivity when confronted with a problem easily resolved by taking a simple detour. The reason is that in this new unorganized world, it lives in a biological regime of perception, expecting to find enemies or prey or even partners, but does not see things as objects that would induce intelligent conducts. Humans act the same way, and what used to be called regression could be understood as implementing perceptual categories of biological type due to the novelty or emotional aspect of the situation. Any entirely new situation, any intense rupture in a normal situation, presents an opportunity to start perceptual classification anew, beginning with sifting through primary valences. This is kind of what you were just saying. The biological happens at the level of the entire organism, and before properly psychic perception happens, the territory has to be established, which is this broad categorization of what is going on. And then objects can be perceived once the territory has been decided on. This point about animals being closer to this more primary activity, I think in the Abecedere, Deleuze says something like about how cats are never relaxed or something along those lines. Like they always seem like there could be something that could, it's very easy for them to be provoked into like a fight or flight response. I wonder if he had something like this in mind.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot that we can, a lot of connections we can make with Deleuze and Guattari about, the concept of territory and, deterritorialization and so on. I think here, maybe what I would start with is the notion of a territory. It already implies a certain structure to the environment, right? There's like a boundary, even if it's a vague one. There's some sort of limit to this portion of the world is my territory, and this other portion of the world is not. So there's already some structure just in the fact that you have, a distinction between my territory and not my territory. And then normally there's also some sort of directional valence, I guess you could say, to the territory. So there's like within my territory, there's my burrow or my nest or whatever for the organism. There's like the sort of center or the core of the territory where the organism feels the safest. And then the rest of the territory is sort of organized around that. So whenever an organism is sort of out looking for food or doing whatever it does in its territory, and then it feels frightened, it will sort of run away and try to hide, try to find its burrow or its nest or whatever that center of the territory is. So the whole territory is not just organized in terms of the distinction between my territory and not my territory, but also it has this directional structure in that it's organized around a center of some kind. So there's already even just these are just sort of extremely basic consequences of the fact that something is a territory, but there's already some structure to the environment. And then when we start having maybe more specific features of the environment, so things that are characteristic of an environment for a particular organism. So if say a dog's territory has particular smells. Dogs, of course, their world is sort of primarily oriented towards smells. So they will recognize, this territory has my smell, and this other, the next door territory has the smell of another dog. So there's a whole structure, like a whole world of smells that organizes their territory, and they might recognize paths through their territory based on smell and so on. So you can see how more and more structure gets sort of built up on the territory. And what this allows is for the organism to experience entities within their territory, not just as requiring some kind of immediate response like attack or flight or whatever, but as entities that fit into that structure in a particular way. So it can be and in particular, what this allows for is problem solving. Seeing an entity not just as an exemplar of the category predator or prey or whatever, but as something that can be used in multiple ways. So something you can walk on, something you can pick up, something you can break or manipulate in various ways. Once you are capable of perceiving an object, so as something that has multiple properties that can be used in multiple different ways, then you can use that object to solve problems that are, appropriate for that particular species. And sorry, the example of the jaguar here, I think, is an interesting one. I don't know what studies in particular Simondon was talking about here, but there's been, I think, maybe the last 20 years or so, there's been a lot of research. So this is much later than what Simondon was talking about, but there's been a lot of research sort of revisiting animal psychology, and in particular earlier studies that showed that this particular animal is not capable of solving this kind of problem because it turned out that the animal was incapable of solving the problem when it's in a particular kind of environment. So in like a lab setting with bright lights and weird noises and cold floor and all this stuff, the animal is not capable of solving this particular type of task. But if instead you have a more natural setting, a setting that resembles the animal's real environment, where it would be if it were not held in a lab, then the animal is much more capable of problem solving. So the task. It's not the task itself that the animal is not capable of. It's doing this kind of task in an environment that is not that doesn't resemble its own territory. And so there's this very important link between the territory as this structured domain where the animal can sort of situate itself, and the capacity to solve problems by perceiving entities in the world as objects that have multiple properties.
I wonder how this relates to the point that Simondon made in Volume 1 about how the laboratory settings fail to capture the importance of the role of affect in perception, in human perception.
Yeah, that's a good point. Obviously, in the case of psychological experiments on humans, there are limits to what sorts of affective responses you can do just for ethical reasons. Like you normally there's the famous Milgram experiment where they got people to administer electric shocks to actors, and they were told that there was a lethal dose of or a lethal level of electric shock, and the subjects were sort of coerced into administering what they thought was a lethal electric shock. And so this obviously would cause a lot of stress and distress for the subjects, and no ethics board today would allow an experiment like that. So just any sort of very extreme affective response is very difficult to elicit in a lab setting in a way that doesn't, completely violate the subject's, basic rights to not have horrible things happen to them. So yeah, in an experimental setting, it makes it hard to elicit the full range of behaviors for human beings. I think maybe the difference here, though, is that I think maybe what Simondon would say is that human beings sort of treat the whole world as their territory in a way that other animals don't. That we are maybe our sort of default response to entities in the world is to treat them as objects that we can use for problem solving. And the sort of fight or flight response, or this whole organism response, is something that only occurs in situations of a sort of especially strong affect. Whereas for other organisms, there's probably more of a dominance of the whole organism response, and then the partial response, the psychological level of response, is sort of less is an exceptional result. So yeah, maybe that's the difference between the human case and other animals. Okay, so let's go on to the next subsection. This one's a bit longer, so let's read about a page from the subsection break if I can get a volunteer.
I can read. Subsection 2. The image is immediate anticipation in the identification of the object, image, and concept. On the basis of experiments and observations, ethologists have rigorously defined conduct of the primary perceptual type in which positioning towards the milieu cannot wait for information to be complete. One must speak, begin to act, take an active attitude, and get nearer, which is a genuine operative conjecture on the possible nature of the object as belonging to one of the categories to which the individual's action system applies. Hence, the bee-eating wasp chasing domesticated bees does not have sufficient capacity for sensorial synthesis and integration of remote information to group all of the information before launching towards his prey. If he waited to have enough information to succeed with certainty, he would miss every opportunity. Here, conduct is perceptual motor in the sense that it is composed of successive waves of information gathering and motor reactions that modify the relationship between the organism and the milieu, pulling the wasp closer to the bee and allowing it to implement a different sense than the one before. Each wave of sensorial data is the releaser or trigger for a defined reaction, allowing the reception of a new wave of information provided by another sense. At the close of the action, enough information is gathered to identify the object, as though the sensorial synthesis had been possible from the position of primitive observation. But with this progressive perceptual motor conduct, error cannot be avoided. For the insufficiency of monosensorial information in the first stages, especially the first stage, leaves large chances of error, for instance 9 out of 10. Such conduct are nonetheless possible and productive according to the logic of increasingly committed trial and error. On the basis of errors avoided, since the first tries engage relatively little activity and are totally reversible. Getting randomly closer to a possible prey, hiding for no real reason in one's burrow at the slightest alarm. These are conducts as easily undone as they are accomplished, in contrast to the consummating operations at the close of their actions and in direct contact with the prey, following the grouped perception or the successive stages of approach behavior. In fact, progressive perceptual motor behaviors, the role of perceptual images is primordial. Since perception is given only at the end of the activity, at the moment of consummation, each preceding stage is founded on a sketch of perception, that is, precisely the image. The image is the anticipation of the object through potential characters that are richer than the capture of the identified object. The flying object that triggers the approach of the wasp may be a domestic bee, a bumblebee, or a wild bee. It is an entire class that triggers a pursuit. Posteriorly, the contributions of other senses will reduce this anticipation, rich with possibilities, and only presupposing the necessarily primordial compatibility to trigger an effective response, attitude allowing a continuation of the approach. In the case of the human, we can give examples of those images presupposing a vast composability and bringing a defined attitude. Something terrible or threatening, even before one sees what it is, comprises a vast composability and generates an attitude of flight, defense, or circumspect information gathering. The impression that something is happening, that an important event has just occurred, is the richest, even though it contains no informational precision. This interest of novelty, causing a high level of vigilance, may then become diversified according to definite categories: arrival of friends or foes, bad or good news, or sudden obligation. Through successive waves, the situation closes around the identification of an object with which properly psychical activity begins. A gathering around an accident, a riot, the scramble of people fleeing, are first perceived in a primitive manner even by humans, when the subject is in a situation where sensorial data arrive in a new and unexpected way. Images appear, then, in the form of perceptual anticipations of potentialities, as more general than individual objects. Should we consider them as analogues to concepts and as basis for concepts? They differ from concepts in that they are a priori, allowing the insertion of the living being in its milieu, and are not the result of an inductive experience, thereby a posteriori construction summarizing experience. Yet we may consider them as the basis of certain concepts which are in fact images enriched and focalized by experience, at times in a single image. Prego. In reality, these a priori categories of perception are one basis for spontaneous associations and evocations taking place after perception. They prolong images of long-term anticipations and insert themselves in the relations to the milieu, even if motivations are less strong than those allowing entirely pre-perceptual images to be expressed. Class images are gestaltized as experiments of the school of ethology on the perception of birds of prey by domestic fowls have demonstrated. In order for the alarm reaction to take place, not only must the lure present the short neck stimulus, but the beak must be pointing forward in the direction of motion. There is then an a priori conjunction of form and motion in this configuration. In other configurations, there are a priori linkages of color and movement pattern, for instance. In the reactions of sexual pursuit in the male butterfly, we might also cite the gestaltized combinations of attitude, for example, raised head, form, for example, inflated abdomen, and color, gray but not red. That is the a priori perceptual image the female stickleback has of the male, triggering the characteristic mating spin. Such gestaltized a priori are usually organized in more or less complex series with each configuration during conduct, like pre-mating exhibition forming the trigger for the subsequent series. But what matters here is the a priori gestaltized character of each of the images allowing an action sequence. It is this configuration that collects sensorial data and constitutes the neurophysiological key of the reaction. If incident stimuli do not display features corresponding to the image, the reaction does not occur. While they are not concepts, these stable configurations allow perception to be effective and followed by a selective action, even when it is not addressed to a specific individual but merely to a specimen of the species presenting the requisite features. See the course l'instinct in 1964 to 1965. These configurations are thus, for instinctual conducts, analogs to concepts for more elaborated conducts based on learning.
Right. So here we're looking at these. So he's drawing on research in ethology, so the study of animal behavior, and he's thinking primarily of Konrad Lorenz and I forget his first name, Tinbergen. But anyway, so the idea is that animal behavior, or the behavior of many animals, involves this structure of a sort of releaser experience. And then there's a sort of sequence of releasers for different stages of the action. So like mating behavior in the stickleback, like he mentions here, the stickleback is a kind of fish. The male has to perceive the specific features of the female before it performs the sort of mating ritual. And at each stage of the process of performing this mating ritual, it has to perceive the correct response from the female or something resembling the female. And the other example that Simondon talks about here is the bird of prey stimulus. So what I think this was one from an experiment from Lorenz. They took like a cardboard cutout of a vaguely sort of bird of prey shape, and they draw it through the air in the vicinity of a bunch of geese or ducks or whatever. And they, did different variations on the shape and different variations on movement, and etc. And what they determined is that the two features that this cardboard cutout has to have are the sort of short neck with a beak and movement in the direction of the beak. So the beak has to be at the front of the moving cardboard cutout. And if you have these two features, then the ducks or geese will react to this movement of the cardboard cutout as if they're responding to seeing a bird of prey flying overhead, and so they'll fly away or in some way try to avoid this bird of prey that they think is there. But then if you for example, if you take the cardboard cutout and turn it in the other direction, so the beak is facing the back of the opposite direction from the direction of movement, then the ducks or geese won't respond to the cardboard cutout as if it were a bird of prey. So they just sort of ignore it. And so these behaviors. Oh, sorry. There's a bit of noise. I'm just going to mute you temporarily, just to avoid the noise. There we go. Right. So yeah, and then the behaviors of these organisms are structured into a sequence of these different responses. So in the case of the wasp, the first stage is just sort of approaching something that it takes to be a bee, one of its prey animals. So any sort of small moving object is probably good enough to trigger this response of approaching, because it's something that is a relatively low investment of energy and resources. So it can just sort of try, even if it has a high chance of error, it will just try to do it, and then if it succeeds, then it goes to the next step. If it turns out that that the object that the object was not a bee, then it will just go to the next object and try again. But then if it turns out that it is a bee, it will proceed with the next phase of the, capture of prey. And so each stage goes to, brings about the following one. And so this is sort of what Simondon sees as the basis for certain types of concepts. So he thinks we need to distinguish between concepts that have this a priori nature, in the sense that they're sort of built into the organism before the experience of the object, and then the a posteriori concepts that we acquire through learning. So some of the concepts, a concept of a mate, for example, is one that an organism generally doesn't have to learn. It has a sort of it has the pattern of what a mate looks like. It knows this pattern before having to actually experience potential mates. And then other concepts like an obstacle to get around, for example, are things that it might have to learn through experience. It might have to, determine that, trees are things that I have to walk around, or whatever other, type of obstacles. There's the distinction between these two different types of concepts that Simondon is drawing on here.
I thought this part where he initially says that they're different from concepts because they're a priori, and he seems to be suggesting here that concepts are the result of inductive experience, which is kind of interesting in light of all the German idealism stuff I've been reading, where obviously concepts are always, well, the most important concepts are a priori. But I didn't understand this at first, but I like this notion that concepts or these Gestalt images are characterized by compossibility. This seems to be an effect of their generality. So, like the anticipatory image that the bee wolf wasp experiences can be particularized in many different ways, and sometimes it's a bee and sometimes it's not. So it's compossible with various particularizations. Does that sound right?
I took that. I mean, I didn't sort of look into that very closely, but I took that to be something slightly different. I took this idea of compossibility to mean that we have, like, so in the case of the wasp, it can experience this small moving object as a bee. That's sort of one categorization of the object. And then the next stage is when it gets closer. I don't know what the next sort of triggering feature is, but maybe it's the color of the entity is the next feature, and that says, okay, yes, this actually is a bee. So it's what I understood the compossibility to consist in is the compossibility of these multiple features that trigger different responses in this sort of coherent sequence of actions that lead up to the capture of prey or mating or whatever the actual behavior is. So it's like all the different features sort of cohere with each other and bring about the overall adaptive response of, yes, this is a bee, I'm going to capture it and eat it. and so that's how I understood the composability. But like I said, it's not something that I really looked into, so I'm not sure that's correct.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. I think that's compossibility is an interesting way to think of the concept, as well as just comprising multiple. It's compossible, or that many particulars are compossible within a concept as members of the concept, or as falling under it, I guess.
Yeah, here I think maybe one reason why Simondon hesitates when he talks about concepts and sort of using the term concept for these sort of a priori responses is that the relation of an organism to a prey entity or a predator or whatever is on the one hand is a response to it as a member of a species or as a representative of a certain category. But on the other hand, it's not sort of a generalization. So like when the ducks run away from the shape that they perceive as a bird of prey, they're not saying, they're not sort of drawing an inference like, birds of prey eat ducks. I'm a duck, therefore I'm going to run away. They're just sort of responding to the presence of this shape and running away. So there's a certain singularity or particularity to the response of the duck. So it has some features of a concept in the sense that they're responding to this shape as a bird of prey. So there's a certain generality to it, but at the same time, it's a singular response. It's a response, right now I'm going to run away. It's not some sort of generalization about birds of prey. It's not a thought like birds of prey have this property or something along those lines. So I think maybe that's why Simondon is sort of hesitant to describe these as conceptual. Yeah, ducks doing syllogisms is an interesting idea. And yeah, there's a whole sort of literature starting in the 19th century about unconscious inferences in perception. So like I think we may have talked about this in another session. I can't remember what the context was, but like the certain visual illusions, for example, optical illusions, you can sort of explain how they occur by means of the idea that our mind is drawing certain inferences, even though we're not aware of doing so. What status exactly this concept of an unconscious inference should have in cognitive science or psychology is I guess a controversial question, and I think it gets harder to sort of maintain that this is something valid the further you get away from sort of the core cases of like optical illusions and the like. So in the case of the ducks that are perceiving, the ducks that perceive this shape as a bird of prey, it starts to become, I think, hard to like accept that idea that they're drawing an inference. It seems like that's a very inefficient way of bringing about the actual response of running away. And evolutionarily, we would expect that ducks that have to sort of go through a syllogism to decide whether or not to run away were probably not the ones that would survive by escaping predators the fastest. Okay, so let's go on to the next subsection. So yeah, this one is a bit longer, so let's just read a page or so, if I can get a volunteer.
I can read again. Subsection 3, the particular characters of images and instinctual perceptions depending on species, social aspects. Ethology has analyzed quote-unquote releasers in animal conducts better than in human ones, since residues of learning play a masking role in human behavior. The type of figurations varies according to the dominant sense of each species. For birds, these are often sets of visual stimuli so specific that in the guise of feather appendages, they guarantee against crossbreeding of different varieties of the same species. This is the case of the set of colored feathers on the underside of duck wings, which males display, by beating their wings during mating behavior. Songs and movements may also play the role of behavioral stimuli keys. In a large number of species, predators, prey, and relatives correspond to interperceptual images. Tinbergen speculates that a similar function exists among humans who perceive certain allures and configurations that have a meaning for their instinctual conducts. Hence, there exists a characteristic configuration of the infant perceived by parents, convex forehead, chinless. This image reappears in ersatz animals that fulfill the need for instinctual satisfaction. The childless woman adopting pets chooses those that have the characteristics of the image of the infant. Dolls made by adults are ersatz of children. The optimal child selected for the needs of the film industry, Shirley Temple of Yore, incarnates the image as a quote-unquote releaser for instinctual conducts. A bird with a long pointy beak does not elicit maternal feelings, while a sparrow or red robin does. We should note, too, that the film industry sometimes constructs groupings or condensations of perceptual configurations, such as the image of the child woman, femme enfant, with, on one hand, aspects corresponding to sexual quote-unquote releasers, and on the other hand, to children's features. Such condensations are possible because each image, being merely a configuration or grouping of features rather than a determined object, does not present the problem of the excluded middle. Shirley Temple, beyond her optimal babyish appearance, was sexualized through dancing, singing, and situations in which she was the partner of adult males. Brigitte Bardot, corresponding to the optimal feminine appearance, was also, in some of her parts, if not a child, at least a gamine. Finally, certain collective circumstances produce other groupings, such as the quote-unquote toy soldier, who is both the child to be protected and the virile hero, the soldier at the front. Are biological images corresponding to instinctual conducts constant over time for a given species? This is a delicate question, especially for the human species. The quote-unquote schematic idols from Cycladic or Minoan cultures present an appearance for women that does not conform to the canons of modern European societies. Prehistoric Deatopagus figures are even more surprising. We must therefore presume that images intervening in perception are either subject to evolution or sufficiently indeterminate to receive different formulations when they show up in art forms or magical and religious representations. So I'm trying to figure out how this hangs onto the preceding paragraph or the preceding section. And I guess that the releasers are what is triggered by the Gestalt, what does he call them? The images or the groups of images that trigger these behaviors.
Yeah, so here he's sort of extending this to the human case, and he mentions that these concepts of releasers and releasing behavior have been treated mostly in non-human animals and not in humans. So this is obviously more speculative, but I don't remember if he actually points this out maybe a bit later. But one of the sort of results of some of the early ethology study was that certain stimuli are actually certain artificial stimuli, I should say, are actually more effective at releasing behavior than the sort of natural object that induces that behavior. So I think I mentioned this in a previous session. There was a certain kind of seagull that its eggs are like off-white with brown spots or something like that, and the ethologists produced these artificial eggs that were much bigger than their own eggs, and they were like bright yellow with red spots. And the birds actually preferred these artificial eggs. They would sit on and like try to hatch the artificial eggs and abandon their own eggs. So the sort of schema that they have of like what an egg looks like, or the sort of perceptual properties that an object has to have for them to say that's a good egg, that's something that I want to sit on, are sort of, you know, the color contrast between the spots and the background color, and size, and so you can sort of artificially induce the behavior by exaggerating the contrast and the size. And so Simondon is sort of drawing on this idea and looking at human behaviors in relation to the film industry in particular. So we can see, I think, a lot of like fashion, makeup, and all these sorts of things as sort of playing the same role of artificially releasing certain responses in humans in a similar way as these sort of fake eggs did with the seagulls. So something like just a really basic example would be lipstick, for example, emphasizes or exaggerates the color contrast between lips and skin. So that we can see this as a sort of artificial releaser of a certain response in other humans. And Simondon talks about some of the film industry examples. So Shirley Temple, for those who maybe don't know, she was a child star in, I think, the 1930s, or maybe a bit later. I'm not sure exactly. But anyway, she was one of the early child stars in Hollywood, so Simondon takes her to be sort of like the optimal image of the child. So in the same way that the seagull sees this, red and yellow egg as like the sort of optimal egg, humans watch, or at least Europeans watching these movies, see Shirley Temple as like the optimal child, and so like all of the sort of child features, everything that makes an object sort of exemplify the nature of a child is sort of exaggerated or highlighted in Shirley Temple and in the way that she's presented in Hollywood movies. The makeup and hairstyles and clothing and camera angles and everything, all of that sort of goes into exaggerating her quality as like the optimal child. But then he points out that something that sort of complicates this analysis is that you can have these like condensations of multiple images into one entity. So he talks about the child woman sort of condensation. So on the one hand, Shirley Temple is this optimal child, but on the other hand, she sort of is treated as a woman, as an adult human, in the way that she is sort of paired with adult men in certain films, and her singing and dancing and so on. So the image that she is sort of incarnating is at the same time this optimal child, but then also the woman. And then sort of the other direction with Brigitte Bardot, Simondon sort of puts it that she's like the optimal woman, or the optimal woman image. But she also sort of takes on the role of at least being childish, if not actually a child. There's a sort of condensation of multiple images into one entity, or an entity can take on images corresponding to different types of objects. And then he also points out that there's a difficult question of to what extent are these image releasers in human beings sort of a biological constant, and to what extent are they culturally malleable, I guess. And he points out too that there are these prehistoric sculptures, they're sometimes called like prehistoric Venus or whatever. I was trying to find an image of some of these, but they have certain exaggerated features that most of us today, or in Western societies at least, would not describe as being beautiful. But it seems, I mean, it's hard to sort of know exactly what their use or understand how they were understood in societies that haven't existed for tens of thousands of years. But it seems like they were experienced as beautiful or desirable in those societies. And so it does seem like there has been change over time in terms of which sort of what sort of shape is experienced as like the optimal woman or the optimal child or the any of these sort of optimal images is subject to variation over time.
I wonder if this the point about the images not presenting the problem of the excluded middle is another way in which they differ from concepts, which obviously do present that problem.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so if you're thinking in concepts in the sort of strict sense of the term, of course, you can't classify the same entity as a child and as an adult woman at the same time. You would have to, pick one or the other, and those two concepts are exclusive of each other. But in the case of these images, you can have sort of the same entity can incarnate multiple images or can trigger multiple responses in observing humans that corresponds to different types of entities. So yeah, I think that's maybe a good reason why Simondon is hesitant to describe this kind of behavior as conceptual.
An interesting thing I thought was that the language of condensation and I think he mostly speaks of condensation here, and specifically then in relation to human cultural context, right? Introduces already basically a structuralist semiotic language, right? Like condensation and what's the English term for Verschiebung? I don't know. Like the two in Freud, the two operations of the unconscious, right? In the primary process, and in structuralist semiotics with metaphor and metonymy and Jacobson. You have these operations at the base of discursive processes, and I found it interesting that that parallel here because it maps nicely right in this region of ambiguity between what basically like where we are in this twilight zone between natural and cultural images, if you want to use that language, are here in this discussion, right? Sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but yeah, and also I kind of had this association to like there's a German book about Foucault's Darwin reception that's making a claim to reading evolution as a semiotic process, where it draws on a concept, or where it draws on or that comments on a kind of thing like this, where it argues that like beauty and like symbols in animal mating behavior still are semiotic processes, right? Like that you can't treat them as as automatic stimulus response chains of basically a code where every signal has a definite response, but that it's very much a semiotic process where some kind of semiosis, so slippage of meaning is happening. I'll stop rambling, but that was just some associations I had there.
Yeah, that's interesting. The English for Verschiebung is displacement. So yeah, condensation and displacement are these two processes in the dream work that Freud talks about. And yeah, so when Simondon here uses the term condensation, I think we're definitely meant to hear a sort of psychoanalytic resonance there. And I think there's a kind of, I guess, how you get more complicated images that are not just that sort of code that you're talking about, where you have like this type of experiential input produces this type of behavioral output. So condensation is one means through which you get more complicated interactions between images and behavior. So if an object can exhibit images that, or can exemplify images with different types of behavioral responses that are appropriate to them, then the organism that sort of perceives this object as having these conflicting images or these different images incarnated in it, the organism has to sort of decide which one, whatever exactly you want to understand by decide, but it has to sort of select one of those images as being the one that it will respond to. So if you, the child woman condensed image, you have to either respond to this person as a child or as a woman, and you can't sort of do both at the same time, or at least it's more complicated to do both at the same time. So the behavioral response will have more sort of richness and openness, I guess, insofar as the images allow for this kind of condensation to happen. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I can read if I can get through without coughing. So let me try to get through that. Okay. Finally, Tinbergen considers that the triggers of instinctual conduct can only act in a concrete perceptual situation. In particular, a regulation of conducts takes place through changes in the configuration of the concrete and complete situation. A fight might be stimulated at the onset by the sight of the opponent, but it is conversely de-escalated as soon as the opponent is viewed on the ground, wounded or bleeding. The perception of spilled blood forcefully inhibits aggressiveness. It corresponds to an instinctual image. Indeed, we note the existence during fights among animals of submission or retreat, inhibiting the opponent's aggressiveness even before any wound. Tinbergen suggests that contemporary wars have become particularly lethal, not only by way of an increase in weaponry power, but also because weapons hit remotely without any possibility of seeing the image of dead or wounded enemies. The situation has become all the more ambiguous since the stimulation of aggressive conducts takes place as much or even more than before through the image of the opponent, while the instinctive de-escalation of the deployment of aggressive conduct, the image of a corpse, no longer exists. Sometimes photojournalists and war correspondents act as channels for the inhibiting image. During the Korean War, newspapers across the world printed the photo of a 4 or 5-year-old Korean girl crying on the battlefield over her dead parents, alone amidst a chaotic landscape. A similar event occurred recently in France when a little girl named Delphine was the victim of a terrorist attack. In relation to the development of each individual, elementary interperceptual images emerge one after the other to make possible the perception of reality with a defined meaning. We could call this the, quote, possible consciousness, unquote, of the individual. It is not a matter of global perceptual or intellectual development, but of the capacity for perceptually processing the meaning of a situation. Hence, a child non-sexually aware might perceive the mating behavior of animals as a fight. In the performance of a play from classical theater, a child scarcely perceives the situations having to do with amorous feelings. Such scenes are for him without structure and empty. By contrast, a dispute over an injustice, like the one with which Corneille opens Le Cid, is clearly perceived by a young child, since situations of competition correspond to his own relation with the milieu. The notion of possible consciousness is indeed related to the perception of situations in a primitive mode, yet it is difficult to account for it with the notions of gestaltization defined by ethology, since it implies a collective aspect. At a certain time and in a given situation, a given group is able to grasp the meaning of a situation, while other situations do not have any meaning for it. For instance, during the Russian Revolution, peasants immediately grasped that land ownership had changed, but not that political authority no longer belonged to the Tsar. Possible consciousness acts as a selector of the incident information, welcoming certain traits and refusing others. In the genesis of myths and the deformation of news and the spread of rumors, possible consciousness plays a central role. Hence, Christianity was seen in Rome as an initiatory religion conducting the human sacrifice of small children, since such a conception corresponded to the representation of actual initiatory cults in some religions from distant lands. Here, possible consciousness amounts to the, quote, non-Roman, unquote, as compounding all that is exotic and barbarous. Of course, since these are conscious representations belonging partly to cultural contents, we might say that there is nothing biological in such ways of perceiving. Still, they are primary, but at the level of the collective. They are modified according to collective conditions, feeling of danger, pressure towards conformity, and constitute the basis for psychosocial regulations. The representation of the foreigner or the deviant is in reality a perception. The socius is perceived without mediation in a way that is as primary and as gestaltized way as the partner or nurturing parent is. The idea that the domain of social reality is that of learned behaviors, while the directly biological categories devolving from instincts would be spontaneous, is very much theoretical. On the plane of phenomena, intraperceptual images have meaning for psychosocial situations. They're no less spontaneous or less primary than those that allow for a primordial adaptation to dangerous situations or the relationships between parents and their young. The human face, seen frontally, whether familiar or unknown, is probably one of the first gestaltized perceptions of the infant. The valence of familiarity or foreignness is part of perceptual processing, as is that of predator or prey. This foreshadows the importance of the perceptual and primary character of cultural stereotypes, cliches, with their attendant reactions. Humans are zoon politikon. Let's actually stop here. And we'll read the next bit after. Right, so here, these are more examples of the relationship between these sort of releasing images and the behaviors that they're related to, and in particular, only organisms that have the possibility to respond in particular ways are able to react to certain features of the environment. Like the examples that he talked about here have to do with aggressive behaviors. So many animals, in many mammals at least, the males will fight over a female or the opportunity to mate with a female. But most of the time, these fights don't proceed, to the death. One of the males will withdraw once it sort of realizes that it is not capable of defeating the other. So they're in the whole sort of set of behaviors that make up this fighting ritual or this fighting behavior. There's some sort of withdrawal or submission behavior. And then once the other organism sees that the first organism is submitting, the aggression response is sort of inhibited or de-escalated. So it's only because the organism has this capacity to first respond with aggression, but then secondly to inhibit that aggression. It's only because of this that the organism can actually respond to the submission behavior of the first organism. What Simondon tries to extend this to the human case with a few examples having to do with, for example, children watching a play. So he suggests here that they don't fully understand the love stories in a play. I don't know, Romeo and Juliet or something like that. This idea that, small children don't have the experience of being in love and passion, overcoming other responsibilities and so on. So this aspect of the play is something that they will sort of goes over their head. They don't really understand what's going on. But an aspect of the play in which a person protests against an injustice that's been done to them, the children understand this very well because they experience injustice being done to them or unfairness being done to them on a regular basis. So this is what Simondon means here by possible consciousness. So an organism or a person is only capable of responding, of experiencing certain types of images insofar as they have this capacity to perform the appropriate behavior.
I think the idea that this possible consciousness is collectively determined is really interesting. And in Volume 1, Simondon argued at various points that certain aspects of psychic life are only possible in the collective. including knowledge and action. And maybe this idea of a collective possible consciousness, which determines even perception, apparently, in this section, is one instance of what he had in mind in that those passages in Volume 1.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I think maybe here when he talks about collective, he's not thinking of his more sort of specific usage of that term in individuation. So in individuation, we saw that he distinguishes between, let me see if I remember the exact terminology, but he talks about sort of social organization through the division of labor. So there are organizations in which individuals have particular roles that they have to play. One person is the janitor, one person is the receptionist, one person is the president of the company or whatever. There's particular social roles that everyone plays in an organization. And then there's the other sort of extreme is exchanges between individuals. So the market is sort of the paradigm instance of this. So each individual is sort of a pre-given entity, and then they sort of perform some exchanges of goods or services or whatever. But those exchanges are sort of external to their nature of what they are. And then the collective is something sort of intermediate or distinct from either of those two types of sort of organization of individuals with each other. And the collective has to do with this sort of second level of individuation. So the individuals within a collective are not pre-given before they form the collective. They undergo a new kind of individuation into a collective. So that's sort of a quick summary of like his specific idea of what a collective is. But I'm not sure if here he's using that exact idea of the collective or his sort of specific idea of the collective, or he's just talking about social groups in general. And the reason why I think he might not be talking about his own conception of the collective is that a lot of these types of a lot of these types of images that he's talking about are sort of pre-given and not things that have to undergo a sort of new individuation. So like the Romans who think that Christianity is a child sacrifice cult, they sort of have this pre-given sort of stereotype of what foreigners or foreign religions consist in, and they just sort of classify Christianity under this pre-given concept. So this, to me, doesn't seem to have anything like a sort of process of individuation going on in it. There's a pre-given concept, and you just find something and stick it under that concept. So I think here when he talks about the collective, he's probably not thinking of it in the specific terms that he used in individuation.
I think that the Romans would certainly be a collective, and I think that the perception among the Romans is of things outside of Roman culture is determined by these the possible consciousness of the Roman collective, I guess is how I was reading that.
Yeah, so there's definitely so the Romans as a group, I'll just use the term group here instead of collective provisionally. So Romans as a group have this possible consciousness, so they don't have a sort of a category to put Christianity under that doesn't sort of deform it. So the only category that they have for Christianity is this foreign barbarous cult, so therefore they must sacrifice children. So the group at this the group here sort of determines what kinds of experience or perception of Christianity individual Romans will be able to have. And so in this sense, the group determines the possible consciousness of an individual Roman. But I think the question about whether this group corresponds to the collective from the individuation book, the question is there something like an individuation happening when a Roman sort of perceives Christianity as a child sacrifice cult? And I think the answer to that is no. I think what's happening is that the Roman is just this individual Roman who says, oh yeah, that they're these foreign barbarians, therefore they must sacrifice children. This Roman is just sort of using pre-given categories that have to do with something like a social division of labor or a pre-assigned social roles, as opposed to sort of performing an individuation.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's like the Romans are a collective, but they are not. There's a epistemological deficiency in the Roman collective's way of knowing these outside groups.
Yeah, so like the collective life of the Romans, for example, would be sort of exemplified by the way that the Romans, I guess Roman political life would be maybe an exemplification of the Romans as a collective. So they sort of understand themselves. Roman citizens understood themselves in terms of where they sort of what sort of role they played in the Roman Republic, if we want to stick to that period, and they sort of thought of themselves in terms of how they contributed to the glory and longevity of Rome. So one of the sort of values that a Roman citizen would exemplify was sacrificing themselves for the Republic. There's the famous line about what is it? Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is good and fitting to die for one's fatherland. So yeah, this was a value that at least officially most Romans would have agreed with, that dying for the Republic or sacrificing your life for the Republic was something that was valuable and good, and so by virtue of sacrificing their lives for this Republic, they're sort of incarnating this collective life of the Republic as something that is beyond any one individual. But then, in relation to other city-states, other peoples in the world that they came across, they sort of fall back into this sort of social role hierarchy, or this structure in which individuals are sort of assigned to these pre-given categories. So a Roman is someone who acts in this way, a foreigner is someone who acts in this other way, and we have these pre-assigned roles, and we just sort of fulfill these roles that we are assigned, so that's, I think, how the Roman who sort of perceives Christianity as this child sacrifice cult is sort of experiencing the world in virtue of these pre-assigned categories.
Right. Yeah. I think what I find really interesting about this is that, like, it's almost like a like value ladenness of perception at the level of the collective. It's not even just a matter of collective values determining, what knowledge is produced and circulated, but even the way that things are perceived by members in the collective, even in a negative sense, obviously here.
Yeah. So here, so for anyone who maybe is not familiar with this terminology, so the value ladenness of perception is something that within 20th century philosophy of science, I forget who actually introduced this term, but there was, in the early 20th century, the logical positivists had this idea that you could sort of take competing scientific theories and reduce them to like protocol sentences. So they would say that, if you stick this piece of paper in the solution, it will turn red. And then the other theory would say, if you stick the paper in the solution, it will turn yellow. And then you would just sort of compare the two theories with the evidence, and you would select the one that has the best, that's verified by the evidence. And the sort of objection to this, and I'm of course oversimplifying here, but the objection to this is that a lot of the time, what the actual conflict between different theories or disagreement between different theories turns out to be is not like some sort of shared idea of what the evidence would be, and then making different predictions, but it's actually that the different theories have like different ideas of what evidence actually is, and so someone who follows like one example, I think Thomas Kuhn, I think, gives this example that Joseph Priestley isolates a gas that he calls dephlogisticated air, and he talks about what role it plays in combustion and so on. And then it's only a few years later that Lavoisier identified this as oxygen, and he explains what role it plays in combustion in a different way. And then one way of talking about it would be to say that they both identified the same gas, but they use different concepts for it. But that sort of is like anachronistic in the sense that we're looking backwards and saying, what we call oxygen is what Priestley called dephlogisticated air. But from the perspective of Priestley and Lavoisier, they were actually talking about different things. The things that they were describing had different properties, and so there was no way of like comparing exactly what predictions those two theories would make, because they were actually talking about different things. And so the sort of alternate way of understanding what happened there is that they were actually perceiving different entities in the world, even though the sort of experimental setup might have been similar. And so here in the case of Simondon, he's talking about this value ladenness of perception in relation to experiential categories of other people, for example, stereotypes and so on. So the Roman who experiences Christianity as a child sacrifice cult is doing this not on the basis of actually perceiving what Christian rituals look like. This is a sort of a category that they already have prepared for Christians or for these exotic religions. So there's a sort of value ladenness to perception in the sense that they already have these categories prepared, and so the actual experience of observing a Christian ritual, they will sort of immediately understand what they see in terms of that child sacrifice concept. Okay, let's read one more. Let's read to the end of this subsection. I'm kind of losing my voice, so we'll just read up to there, and then we'll end for the day. So if I can get a volunteer to read to the section break of subsection 4.
We are the Inventions.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. It froze for a second. Can you hear me?
Oh, no problem. Wait. Sorry. Did mine cut out?
I can't tell if it's on your end or my end. Can you hear me?
Yes. I think it might be my internet.
Okay.
But it looks like it's okay now.
Yeah, it seems like it's working better now. So we're at the existence of images.
Okay. The existence of images constituting the primitive categories of perception before being affirmed in a definite and universal way deserves more pointed research. Indeed, it is beyond doubt that there exists possibilities of qualifying at the onset groups of stimuli according to instinctual categories across many species, especially in the register of the dominant sensibility of each species. For example, minnows have a substance in their blood that spreads in water when an individual in the group is wounded. This substance provokes fright in the entire group. As soon as other individuals detect its presence in water, they adopt an immediate reaction of flight. It is neither a matter of training nor of learning. The sense of sight being dominant among primates, psychologists particularly those of the Gestalt school, have sought to find visual structures acting as similar alarm signals or having the power to attract. A young chimpanzee is scared by a doll whose eyes are made of shoe buttons. This would be called pithicophobogenic visual structure. Yet, Guiraud criticizes this interpretation by stating that the doll scares the young primate because it is new and unexpected in its experience. For Guiraud, the innate structures serving as a basis for perception could not have reached such a degree of selectiveness and precision, if they exist at all. It is indeed very difficult to establish the degree of generality, hence the richness and compossible forms that a primary perception may harbor. Is there either a primary response, a primordial perception for that which is scary or dangerous, or are there two primary categories, attraction and repulsion? And is novelty attractive or repulsive? It is repulsive as possible danger, as presence of a putative predator, but it is also attractive as the possible presence of some object that may be a prey or partner. It is not easy then to affirm that novelty in itself is either repulsive or attractive. Novelty is a category that contains all possibilities of reaction. Prior mobilization of reactions is a state of heightened vigilance. After the first wave of information gathering, this state may be channeled towards inducing an action system to either flight or approach. However, dichotomization into trigger the dichotomization into reactions of flight or approach. This is often the case for the young who have imperfect sensorial adaptations. The response is then vigilance and curiosity. Yet in certain cases, the orientation of reactions seems to be forced on the organism by the immediate meaning of the structure of the stimulus. A dove that has always lived in a cage will react by fleeing when presented with a snake, without any prior reaction of vigilance or curiosity. Young monkeys display fear reactions to a human being dressed in large black veils corresponding to the image of a ghost. On this basis, it is difficult to say whether all perceptions begin with very general stages such as the reaction to novelty before splitting into a dichotomy scheme of flight or approach attitudes, continuing until the activity of consummation execution, or whether some perceptions begin immediately with the reception of an already strongly orienting signal that is selectively received without learning, and that triggers a definite, appropriate reaction as in an automatic function. It is likely that both perceptual modalities exist, and their relative importance depends on the species. They have different consequences for the introduction of learning processes, since the stereotypical response to a stimulus key lacks plasticity and adaptability because it is not progressive. So these stimulus responses, it seems like the primary categories are either there's a novelty that can then be organized into either flight or I guess attraction or repulsion, or there is an automatic attraction or repulsion response, although the only examples we get of those are repulsion responses. Also, it's kind of funny the test where they dressed up as ghosts to scare chimpanzees or whatever.
Yeah, you have to wonder what exactly the research process was where someone decided, yeah, let's dress up as ghosts and see if monkeys are scared. Is that yeah, that reminds me of the earlier one where he talks about monkeys being taught how to write, and where that wasn't very effective. But yeah, the idea here is that there's a certain amount of variation in terms of the extent to which the attraction or repulsion response is sort of immediate. Certain stimuli elicit this attraction or repulsion response without any prior learning or investigation on the part of the organism. Like many organisms will react with a fear response in flight to the presence of a snake, even if they've never actually seen a snake before. And so it's not the case that they've learned that snakes are dangerous or whatever. They experience the snake as dangerous or as something to be feared prior to any learning. And then in other cases, the sort of new the new stimulus or something they've never experienced before doesn't elicit this immediate response of attraction or repulsion. It instead elicits what we would call curiosity, or a sort of investigatory response. So if you just, I don't know, put a box into a chimpanzee's cage, it will probably, pick up the box, try to, open it, or, investigate what exactly this box is, or what it can do with the box. So these types of entities will elicit investigation as opposed to an immediate attraction or repulsion. And so I think the point here is that sorry, I lost my train of thought. Just a sec. So the point is that there's a sort of domain of research that, for Simondon argues, hasn't really been fully exploited yet, which is that you can sort of investigate for different organisms what kinds of stimuli they will experience as attractive and or repulsive prior to any learning, and which ones they will experience just as something new to be investigated. And you can try to classify, what properties an object has to have to fall under one of those categories. So that would be a sort of a whole research program for animal psychology that I think even today probably hasn't been systematically carried out. Yeah, we should do a full investigation of all the different types of monsters and see which ones monkeys are afraid of. Are they afraid of zombies, vampires? I don't know. Okay, so I think we can stop here before my voice gives out completely. We'll pick up from page 71 next time. So hopefully everyone will get back into the habit of meeting every week after our break. Thanks everyone for coming out. Thanks for your contributions, and see you next week.
Thanks, Don. Hope you feel better.